By March of 1917, Ukraine had achieved the independence that it had strived for so long. The struggle, however, was far from over. In October, the Bolsheviks under Lenin staged a coup. In response, the Central Rada declared the Ukrainian People's Republic an independent state that would remain in federal union with Russia. They also claimed new territories in the east and south. These moves were far from pleasing to the new Bolshevik government in Petrograd, which was renamed St. Petersburg. They tried to take power throughout Ukraine by taking control of the Soviets or workers' councils across the country, but most of the delegates to the Soviets were peasants who supported the Central Rada, and their attempts to inspire an uprising failed. The Bolsheviks then sent in the army. Russian troops advanced on Kyiv from the north and west. The Central Rada called for a mobilization of resistance. Although hugely outnumbered, people responded, just as we are seeing right now. In the Chernihiv region, a detachment of around 400 Ukrainian students and cadets took on the advancing Bolshevik forces. 27 of these young Ukrainians were captured and shot by the Bolsheviks. These men are celebrated today as the first martyrs for Ukrainian independence. The Central Rada abandoned Kyiv on February 9, 1918, and headed west. That night, they signed a peace treaty with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. In exchange for Ukrainian grain, the Central Powers offered their armies to help defeat the Bolsheviks. On March 2nd, the Bolsheviks had been driven out of Kyiv and retreated back to Russia. They were then forced to recognize the independence of Ukraine to conclude their own peace treaty with the Central Powers. The Ukrainians had gotten rid of one master, but it appeared that it was now replaced by another. In April of 1918, German authorities dissolved the Central Rada and put in their own puppet government. The new leader, Pavlo Skoropadsky, ruled as a dictator. The former leaders of the Central Rada refused to work with him. Mass worker strikes broke out, and more than 40,000 peasants joined armed detachments of resistance. Then, when Germany surrendered to the French and British, German and Austrian troops were forced to leave Ukraine, along with Skoropadsky. The Ukrainian People's Republic was back in power. However, with the Germans gone, the Bolsheviks prepared to retake Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Galicia, on the border between Poland and Ukraine, a new Ukrainian state, the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, was proclaimed. This caused a war with Poland, who claimed all of this region. On November 1st, the Ukrainians seized control of Lviv. 20 days later, the Poles reclaimed the city. By 1919, the Poles had defeated the Ukrainians. They were then defeated, though, by the Bolsheviks in an offensive against Kyiv. By the end of 1919, the Ukrainian army had been virtually defeated by the Bolsheviks. But although the Bolsheviks controlled large industrial cities of the Ukrainian steppe, they were unable to control the country as a whole. In the countryside, there was a widespread revolt against the Bolsheviks. Finally, Lenin decided to bend. Ukraine would become part of the Socialist Soviet Republic, but they would not be forced to become Russian. The Ukrainians would be able to retain their culture and their language. And so it was that Ukraine became a founding member of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in December of 1922. Under 1921's Peace of Riga, Western Ukraine was incorporated into Poland. In return, the Poles recognized the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The new Soviet ruler, Joseph Stalin, believed that the Russians and the Ukrainians were one and the same people. He was determined to quash any and all independence movements. In 1929, his secret police began a wave of arrests in preparation for a show trial in Kharkiv. In 1928, Stalin implemented the first of his 5-year plans of collectivization. It forced millions of Ukrainian villagers to leave their natural habitat and join collective farms. By March of 1930, 70% of arable land had been collectivized, but the peasants had not gone willingly. In March of 1930 alone, there were 1,700 peasant revolts. The Soviets responded with characteristic brutality. Many were killed, with thousands more being forcibly resettled in remote parts of Siberia. A terrible consequence of the collectivization policy was famine. In 1932, 80,000 people died of hunger in the Kyiv region alone. Still, Stalin refused to even acknowledge the famine, let alone offer any assistance. By the end of 1933, Kyiv and Kharkiv had each lost 1 million people to starvation. In tandem with the deaths by famine came a brutal series of purges orchestrated by Stalin. Any Ukrainian officials who showed the slightest hint of lack of loyalty were arrested and exiled if lucky, and killed outright if not. By the combination of the Great Famine and his political purges, Stalin managed to turn Ukraine into an exemplary Soviet republic. Yet, it had paid a steep price for its great leap forward. Between 1926 and 1937, the population of Ukraine fell from 30 to 26.5 million people. When Adolf Hitler embarked on his world conquest in the late 1930s, he viewed Ukraine as central to his plan. It would become a prime destination for the colonization of German families. Yet when Nazi Germany began its 3-year occupation of Ukraine in 1941, many Ukrainians welcomed its soldiers as liberators from the hell they had been enduring under Stalin. They soon discovered that things could always be worse. Between 1939 and 1945, Ukraine lost nearly 7 million people, with almost 1 million of them being Jews. Every 6th Jew who died in the Holocaust came from Ukraine. When the Red Army advanced into Ukraine after defeating the Nazis in the Battle of Kursk in July of 1943, they found a country that was very different from the one they had been forced to flee from in the fall of 1941. The people now welcomed the Soviets as their liberators. However, these liberators were very suspicious, accusing many of having collaborated with the Nazis. In April of 1945, Soviet Ukraine became a member of the United Nations. Yet the Second World War had devastated the country. Out of 36 million remaining Ukrainians, around 10 million didn't have a roof over their heads, and more than 700 cities and 28,000 villages lay in ruins. With the onset of the Cold War in 1948, the Soviets looked to Ukraine to produce food, arms, and soldiers for the coming war against the West. This allowed Ukraine to rebuild its economic potential within 5 years. However, agricultural production did not attain pre-war levels until the 1960s. Following Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the USSR. He had been the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Ukrainian USSR and so had an intimate knowledge of the country. In contrast to his predecessor, he emphasized friendship between Ukraine and Russia. In 1954, Russian Crimea officially became Ukrainian Crimea. In 1964, Khrushchev was ousted by Leonid Brezhnev, who had been born in Ukraine. However, the rule of Brezhnev would see a return to Stalinist policies and the reinstatement of controls on public debate and a return to political repression. Arrests of suspected dissidents were renewed, with young intellectuals being the main targets. Brezhnev died in his sleep on November 10, 1982. He was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, who died in December of 1984, and was followed by Konstantin Chernenko, who passed away 4 months later. That brought MIKHAEL Gorbachev to power. Throughout the 80s, he introduced a series of reforms that encouraged the Ukrainians to assert their independence. Gorbachev wanted to reform socialism to make it both more efficient and more user-friendly. He introduced the policies of perestroika, or restructuring, and glasnost, or openness. Of course, this upset the central bureaucracies, which were now exposed to criticism from below. A year after Gorbachev's coming into power, Ukraine suffered the worst technological disaster in world history when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, situated less than 70 miles north of Kyiv, exploded. The disaster and its subsequent cover-up by Moscow increased discontent with Russia. In a sense, it had awakened the Ukrainian people to their desire for independence. 1989 was a landmark year in terms of Ukrainian politics. Mass politics was introduced with the first semi-free elections to the new Soviet parliament taking place. The first mass political organization, the RUK, or Popular Movement for Perestroika, was formed with a membership that quickly built to 300,000. That year also saw the legalization of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which had been driven underground under Stalin's rule. On January 21, 1990, more than 300,000 Ukrainians joined hands in a human chain for independence between Lviv and Kyiv. Then, in October of that year, a student protest campaign known as the Revolution of Granite took place in Kyiv. Its intention was to prevent the signing of a new treaty of the Union of the USSR. At that time, the Cossack myth made its way into the public consciousness. The Cossacks were held up as the ideal example of resistance. A huge march to the east was organized, which included pilgrimages to Cossack sites along the lower Dnieper. It was a huge success, with tens of thousands of marchers joining in. In 1990, elections to the new Ukraine parliament completely changed the political scene, with a growing movement for independence having formed. On August 24, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament adopted the Act of Independence. Even though the act did not call for secession from the USSR, it did give Ukrainian laws precedence over Soviet laws. Ukraine's first presidential elections took place on December 1, 1991. The chairman of the parliament, LEONID KRAVCHUK, was voted in as the country's first president. At the same time, a referendum took place on the issue of independence. It got 90% support from a voter turnout of 84%. On that day, December 1, 1990, the Soviet Union's end was determined. Its new leader, Boris Yeltsin, had been unable to prevent the breakup with Ukraine, and Ukraine's actions had freed up the rest of the Soviet republics to act similarly. The world would never be the same again.